The gate buzzed with restless energy, a tide of travelers dragging carry-ons, clutching tickets and checking their phones. Over the loudspeaker, a boarding announcement cracked through the air. "Group 1 may now board." Among the crowd, a man stepped forward, tall, poised, and dressed in a simple navy suit. He carried no arrogance, only quiet dignity. His presence was steady, calm, yet it drew the sharp eye of the flight attendant standing at the gate. Her lips curled into a tight smile, not warm, not welcoming. Instead, it was the kind of smile that masks judgment. She looked him up and down, her voice laced with superiority. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right line?" The man paused, ticket in hand, and nodded politely. "Yes. Group 1. But she didn't move. Her tone hardened, just enough for those nearby to hear. "Group 1 is for first-class passengers. Priority boarding, not economy." A murmur rippled through the waiting travelers. Eyes flicked toward the man, then back to her. The man stayed calm, his expression unreadable, and handed over his boarding pass. The attendant scanned it, and the green light beeped. First class. The proof was undeniable. Still, she leaned closer and whispered with a condescending edge, "Must be nice. Once in a while." The man said nothing. He simply walked down the jet bridge, his footsteps measured, his shoulders squared. But the sting of her words hung heavy in the air, leaving onlookers uncomfortable, wondering what would come next. The attendant straightened her uniform, pretending nothing had happened. Yet inside, she carried a smug satisfaction, convinced she had put him in his place. What she didn't realize, what no one yet knew, was that this man's presence on the plane was no accident. He wasn't just a passenger. He was here for a reason. And soon, the balance of power would shift. As the cabin doors closed and the engines roared to life, the stage was set for a confrontation that would shake everyone aboard. The cabin was alive with the usual shuffle of boarding passengers, overhead bins slamming, seat numbers being called out, and the soft rumble of engines powering up outside. Yet one moment cut through the noise like a blade. The flight attendant's heels clicked sharply against the aisle floor as she approached the man who had quietly taken his seat in first class. Her eyes narrowed, her tone dripping with suspicion. "Sir, I think you may have mistaken your row. This section is reserved for premium passengers." Her words were deliberate, loud enough to make sure everyone within earshot heard. Heads turned. A young couple paused mid-step, exchanging uneasy glances. The man looked up, calm but firm. "This is my assigned seat. 2A. She forced a smile, but it never reached her eyes. Of course. But if you could just show me your ticket again." The man handed it over. The scanner beeped confirmation, undeniable. Yet she tilted her head, her voice rising even higher. Well, first class it is." She leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough to lace it with contempt. "I'll admit, it's not what I expected." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the surrounding seats. Some passengers pretended not to notice, eyes glued to phones or magazines, silently complicit. Others shifted uncomfortably, their silence almost heavier than the insult itself. The man exhaled slowly, steady as stone. He refused to give her the satisfaction of anger. Yet in his stillness, there was a quiet wound, a reminder of battles fought too many times before. The attendant, emboldened by the lack of confrontation, smoothed her uniform with pride. "Let's just hope you'll be comfortable up here," she said, her words edged like glass. But the way he straightened his posture, the way his eyes lingered on her, not with bitterness, but with a calm calculation, hinted at something deeper, something she clearly hadn't noticed. The other passengers looked on, unsettled, Some would remember this moment far longer than they expected. For now, the humiliation had been public, sharp, and cruel. Yet beneath the silence, something was building, something that would soon shift the entire balance of power. And as the plane prepared for takeoff, the question lingered. Who exactly was this man she dared to underestimate? Whispers have a way of filling silence, soft, fleeting, but powerful. And inside that cabin, after the flight attendant's cutting words, whispers spread like wildfire. A mother leaned toward her wide-eyed daughter in row 3, her voice gentle but firm. "Sweetheart, this is why respect matters. No matter who someone is, you treat them with kindness." The girl nodded slowly, the lesson etched into her young face. Across the aisle, a businessman shook his head, muttering under his breath. "Unbelievable. First class or not, no one deserves that." His words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of truth. Meanwhile, the man at the center of it all sat still, hands folded neatly in his lap. He didn't fidget, didn't lash out, didn't even exchange looks with the passengers around him. His composure was like armor, measured, deliberate, and strangely unsettling. It was as if he had already decided that silence would speak louder than any defense. Passengers stole glances at him, curiosity rising with each second. Who was he? Why didn't he fight back? There was something in the way he observed the cabin, sharp yet controlled, that made people wonder if there was more to him than met the eye. The flight attendant, oblivious to the ripple effect she had caused, busied herself with overhead compartments, chin raised in false confidence. Yet she could feel the eyes on her, and for the first time a flicker of doubt crept into her expression. The air inside the plane grew heavy, not from turbulence, not from altitude, but from the quiet, at awareness that something larger was unfolding, something that would not remain hidden for long. And as the seatbelt sign blinked overhead, that tension followed the passengers into the skies, where truths have a way of breaking free. Engines roared beneath the cabin, a low thunder that vibrated through the floor. Passengers settled uneasily into their seats, buckling belts, stowing bags, and bracing for the climb. But amid the ordinary rhythm of takeoff, an undercurrent of unease lingered, carried not by turbulence, but by the cold edge of one flight attendant's demeanor. She glided down the aisle, her smile as polished as her uniform, yet her eyes betrayed something harsher. When she paused near the man in 2A, her words were carefully wrapped in professionalism, but sharpened with hidden barbs. "Sir, tray table up for departure," she said, her tone clipped. A second later, she added under her breath, just loud enough for him to hear, "We wouldn't want any accidents, would we?" The man looked up briefly, calm as ever, then obliged without a word. But as her heels clicked away, he reached for a small leather folder resting on his lap. From it, he drew a discreet notepad. With steady precision, he began to write. His pen moved in quiet rhythm, details, observations, timestamps. Every glance, every word, every action carefully recorded. Passengers nearby noticed, their eyes flicking from his composed face to the notes, then back again. The questions began to mount. Why is he writing? Who takes notes during takeoff? The flight attendant caught sight of the folder too, and for a fleeting second her confidence wavered. She forced a laugh at something another passenger said, but her gaze kept darting back toward him, curiosity gnawing at her. Outside, the aircraft surged forward, pressing passengers back into their seats. The cabin tilted skyward, lights dimming sleeks, quickly as the jet cut through clouds. But inside row 2A, the tension was climbing faster than the plane itself. The man closed his folder softly, slipping it back into his jacket. His expression remained unreadable, part calm, part calculation. Whatever he was documenting, it wasn't casual. And as the seatbelt sign chimed and the plane steadied at cruising altitude, one truth became undeniable. This flight was carrying far more than ordinary passengers. Because somewhere above the clouds, A silent reckoning had already begun. It began with a sudden jolt. The cabin shuddered, drinks rippling in their cups as the overhead lights flickered. A low gasp spread through the passengers, followed by the captain's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We're experiencing some turbulence." The plane rattled again, harder this time. A baby cried somewhere near the back. A nervous teenager gripped the armrests like they were lifelines. Anxiety spread faster than the turbulence itself. But in seat 2A, the man didn't flinch. His posture remained steady, his expression calm. He leaned toward the woman beside him, whose knuckles were white around her seatbelt buckle. "Don't worry," he said gently. "The plane is built for this. You're safe." His words, steady and measured, worked like an anchor. The woman exhaled, tension easing just a little as she managed a shaky smile. Meanwhile, the flight attendant moved down the aisle with forced composure. Her polished mask was cracking. Her hands trembled as she tried to secure a loose cart, her voice rising in pitch. "Everyone, remain calm," she barked, though her tone betrayed her own fear. Passengers exchanged uneasy looks. Her authority, once sharp and commanding, now felt brittle. Every stumble, every rushed gesture highlighted the cracks in her confidence. And then, another sharp drop. The cabin shook violently, seatbelts straining. The attendant lost her balance, catching herself against a seat. Her forced smile faltered. For the first time, she looked as rattled as everyone else. As in contrast, the man remained the picture of composure. He placed a hand over his notes, protecting them from sliding off the tray, and calmly waited. Not a flicker of panic crossed his face. Passengers began noticing the contrast. The same businessman who shook his head earlier whispered, "Funny. He's calmer than the crew." The turbulence finally eased, the plane finding smooth skies once more. A sigh of relief swept the cabin, but in the aftermath, something had shifted. The attendant's cracks were now visible to all, the man's quiet strength undeniable. And as calm returned to the cabin, the unspoken question grew louder. Who exactly was this passenger, and why did he carry himself like someone in command? The skies had calmed, but the cabin was still heavy with unease. Passengers murmured softly, processing the turbulence and the striking difference between the rattled crew and the unshaken man in seat 2A. Then, something unexpected happened. The cockpit door opened with a quiet click, and the captain himself stepped out. His presence carried weight, his uniform immaculate, his tone deliberate. He scanned the cabin briefly, and then walked straight toward 2A. The flight attendant froze. Her practiced smile faltered as the captain stopped beside the man she had spent the last hour belittling. "Inspector," the captain said respectfully, inclining his head, "I trust everything is satisfactory so far." The word echoed like thunder, "Inspector." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers who had been whispering fell into stunned silence. The businessman's eyes widened, the young mother covered her mouth, and even the nervous teenager sat up straighter, suddenly realizing who had been sitting among them. The man nodded calmly, his voice steady. "I'm continuing my observations. Thank you, Captain." Every syllable confirmed it. This was no ordinary passenger. He was an aviation safety inspector, flying undercover to evaluate the staff, their professionalism, and their treatment of passengers. The flight attendant's face drained of color. Her hands fumbled with the edge of a service cart, her breathing shallow. She understood instantly. Every word she had said, every dismissive glance, every condescending remark had been documented. Passengers turned toward her now, their gazes sharper than before. The judgment she had once wielded so freely was now reflected back at her. The captain, aware of the shift in atmosphere, placed a reassuring hand on the inspector's shoulder before returning to the cockpit. The silence he left behind was deafening. The inspector folded his hands over his lap, his expression calm, controlled, yet undeniably powerful. For the first time, the balance of power was clear. The attendant avoided his gaze, her once confident stride replaced with trembling hesitation. She knew her career, her reputation, perhaps even her job, now hung in the balance. And as the engines hummed steadily, carrying them closer to their destination, the question weighed heavy on everyone's mind. What judgment would the inspector deliver? The flight was far from over, but for her the reckoning had already begun. The air inside the cabin was heavy, thick with silence. Every passenger waited, eyes shifting between the inspector in seat 2A and the flight attendant who now avoided his gaze. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone knew it. The inspector sat forward, his voice calm but clear enough for all to hear. When I boarded this plane, I was not greeted with professionalism. I was met with judgment. I was spoken to as though I didn't belong here. The flight attendant's lips parted, ready to protest, but the inspector raised a hand, measured, controlled. He continued, "In aviation, safety is not just about mechanics or turbulence. It is about trust, respect. When a crew member belittles a passenger, especially in front of others, it creates division, and division undermines safety." Passes. Ngers nodded quietly. The businessman from earlier muttered, "Exactly," his voice cutting through the quiet like affirmation. The inspector pulled his leather folder from his jacket, opening it slowly. The faint scratch of paper filled the silence as he turned a page. "I've documented each moment, every dismissive remark, every attempt to embarrass me publicly. This behavior is not only unprofessional, it is unethical." The attendant's face flushed crimson. Her hands tightened on the service cart until her knuckles whitened. She whispered, I didn't mean—" But the inspector didn't waver. His tone was steady, not angry, but firm with the weight of authority. "Intent does not erase impact. When you undermine a passenger, you not only humiliate them, you send a message to everyone watching that prejudice is acceptable. That cannot happen. Not in the skies, not anywhere." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin. The mother who had whispered to her child earlier nodded solemnly, holding her daughter's hand a little tighter. The truth was undeniable. The inspector's calm authority had spoken louder than the attendant's misplaced superiority ever could. The inspector closed his folder with finality, his gaze locking on hers. "You've been evaluated today, and your actions will not be forgotten." The flight attendant's shoulders slumped, her confidence shattered. She understood. The judgment had been delivered. And as the hum of the engines carried the plane forward, one truth became clear. Respect was no longer optional. The stage was now set for the lesson that would echo far beyond this flight. The cabin was quiet now, the kind of quiet that feels charged, like the air before a storm breaks. Every passenger sat in thought, the weight of what they had witnessed pressing down like gravity. The inspector, still seated in 2A, finally leaned forward, his voice calm, but deliberate, meant for more than just the woman standing before him. "Air travel," he began, his gaze sweeping the rows, "is built on trust. Pilots trust their crew, passengers trust those in uniform. And safety is not just about the wings that hold this plane in the sky. It is about the dignity with which we treat one another." The words carried through the cabin, reaching even those in the last row. Passengers listened, rapt. A lesson was unfolding, not from the pages of a manual, but from lived truth. He turned back to the flight attendant, his eyes steady but not cruel. "When you let prejudice guide your words, you weaken that trust. You make passengers feel small, unwelcome, unsafe. And if trust is broken here, even for a moment, the entire system suffers." She stood frozen, lips pressed together, her confidence stripped away. For the first time since the flight began, she had no words. The uniform she wore no longer shielded her, it exposed her. A businessman in row 3 nodded firmly. The mother whispered to her daughter, "Do you hear that? This is why respect matters. Always." And the little girl, wide-eyed, whispered back, "Always." The inspector's tone softened, carrying a weight that was more compassionate than condemning. "We are all passengers on the same journey, up here and down there on the ground. Titles don't give anyone the right to belittle another human being. Respect is the foundation of safety and of decency." He closed his folder and tucked it away, as though the lesson itself was the final note in his report. The attendant lowered her head, humbled, her silence louder than any apology she could have spoken. As the plane descended, the passengers felt changed. They had not just flown across miles, they had witnessed a truth about fairness and humility. One man's composure had revealed the cracks in judgment, and his quiet strength had set a standard none could ignore. When the wheels touched down and the cabin erupted in applause, it wasn't for the landing, it was for the man who reminded them all of something simple, yet profound. Respect is not optional, because in the skies, as in life, dignity and safety will always go hand in hand.